Being a banker all my life, I have been researching recently on the role of a commercial bank in times of recession. In my lifetime, I can't recall a time where Sri Lanka went through a real recession. We don't know what it is. But it is there, whether we like it or not, whatever the fabrications are, the bitter truth is Sri Lanka is in recession, or if not, accelerating recession. Now I came across this very interesting article called Banks and Future Recessions by Douglas Elliott. And he highlighted that, banks can suddenly pull credit, which can aggravate the recession. Banks will pull credit because they will look at risk and they will stop lending. Then Douglas Elliott says it can aggravate, he calls it financial accelerator. It can accelerate the downturn of economy. Now, when the first COVID happened, we had the central bank, directed by the government, asking the banks to give loans for reconstruction or recovery at 4%. About 60,000 loans apparently have been given. But then our economy is 65% SME. And the institution I work for reached out because it caused a lot of revenue risk. We were asked to securitize. Right. The banks could have looked at it in a different way. The recovery was funded by the governments, and in my view, banks could have looked at it in a different way. When the government said you need to give loans at 4%, banks could have at least for 1 year reduced the interest rate on existing loans of the SME sector to 4% for 18 months or so. Banks were struggling. I read the KPMG banking report of 2020. The credits have gone down. Therefore, the net interest income has dropped. And also on top of that, there's a moratorium, and then that also has caused a loss in net interest income. And just last week, I bumped into a couple of bankers and I asked him, so how is your targets for this year? And you know what he said? He said, sir, we had to make 20% more. Really? And where does that come from? The consumer. And who is the biggest consumer? Is personal and SME sector. So when the NII, the net interest income, is low, where do banks get the revenue from? The export income, the import income, the foreign trade income, fee income has come down. Because of lack of foreign exchange transaction, the exchange income has come down. But what the banks are doing? I had a personal transaction, 258 euros were transferred from for my daughter's education. Guess what, how much I was charged? I was charged 28 euros. That's more than 10%. Right. So, we pay a premium price to buy the dollars for education, mind you. And the bank charges me 10% on a single transaction, on top of making exchange profits. Now, is it moral? I would like you to go and read the annual report of it and see what they're saying. So this is what I suffered personally. So when banks have accumulated billions of reserve, what is the role of banks in a recession? If you pull credit, then you will aggravate, according to Douglas Elliott. And there is evidence to that. How do we make capital available at a lower cost? How do we reduce the banking transaction, cost of banking transaction for the day-to-day operations? Students who are obtaining drafts of foreign education paying as much as 6,000 rupees for a draft. Now, to me, coming from the banking background, that's the transaction cost. And today, with the automation that has happened, with the financial transformation that happened, the cost of transaction has come down. And I would actually wanted to see the Association of Professional Bankers, who had a conference recently, discuss the role of banks in times of recession or in times of economic downturn. Rather, we had digitalization, very futuristic. In a crisis, first you have to survive, then revive, then thrive. There are 3 stages. So we should not look away from the survival mode, which is needed at the moment. Survival of the economy, survival of the SME sector, which is about 60% of our economy, survival of the individual who need basic financial transactions. So isn't it time for banks to look at, the boards of banks to look at the financial objectives for these couple of years and tell the management? I know 2 of my colleagues are chairman of 2 leading banks. But I thought I will still say what I have to say. Shouldn't they be guided to look at a sustaining approach than a growth approach in terms of profit? More economic stabilization approach than increasing profits? Isn't it what is needed? Because banks play a very important role in an economy. They create capital, they create credit, they create employment, they create consumer spend. So in this context, isn't it time for you to go and read back what you say in your annual reports under social responsibility, sustainability, triple bottom line? Beautiful, isn't it? And see whether we really put those words into action. Now is the time, guys. I'm asking my friends and colleagues from the banking industry. This is the time the banks must come forward to make capital available at a lower rate, credit available at a lower rate. Create a trust out of the reserves you have, and then lend on through that trust to essential areas. Education. I mean, students complain that they've been pushed from bank to bank, branch to branch to get a $350 draft to pay for education. Come on. 600,000 people sit for levels. Only 30,000 gets admission to our universities. 5%. The rest have been studying other programs. There are more than 100 universities which are providing franchise education. What are they doing? They're creating the talent of the future for this country. And what is the role of the bank in this time of need? To join that effort and create that talent. People are leaving this country. So where is the bank's future, your sustainability model? Revenue going to come from if the best people leave this country? The people who remain need to be educated so that they can be employed and create economic activity. Come on, guys. You can laugh this off. You can call me names. But the reality is more powerful and it will hit us. And we will look back and say, I should have done something. Please, discuss with your boards, create that trust, help the SME sector, help the students to study, make the fees paid at a minimal cost. Don't make undue profits from the crisis and the absence of foreign currency. Be conscious. This is the time to stretch your hand. This is the time to use your reserve to sustain the country's economy. So bankers, I would have loved to see some discussion in your Association of Professional Bankers conference just concluded recently on how and what the bank should be doing to support the economic downturn. Banks are the vehicle that can bring them up. And mind you, banks are the highest risk when recession hit. From 2008 to today, more than 511 banks have gone bust because you were taking an inward view. It's time you take an outward view. Now, if you look at the inflation, which is around 12%, right, and the interest rate, which is much less, so the money has negative value. You know, in the US, when the inflation went up by 0.5%, the Senate was in discussion. They were talking about cost of production, they were talking about national competitiveness, they were talking about cost of living. And then here, we have a situation where it goes, there was a time the central bank puts ceilings and then they even compel banks to lend for certain sectors. And during this pandemic, this is what most central banks are doing. Central banks are not talking about the green swan. When 2008, the economic downturn, financial downturn happened, they talked about the black swan. Today, after COP26, we are talking about green swan. $500 billion have been committed to green energy. And they were asking for a consortium. That is what our bank should do. There has to be a consortium, there has to be a trust to help the SMEs, which is about 60% of the economy. Because the multinationals can shut up and go. The SMEs are the ones who are suffering, who will suffer. That's our indigenous economy. So let's focus on those and live your annual report, which says you are a socially responsible corporate entity. Thank you.